Mood music going on now?
What's that?
Do we have mood music? Oh,
Yeah. Oh, she's.
I thought you were like providing the audience.
I should.
Is this for Elise?
Yeah. I think so.
Subscribe to my new video. Okay.
Yeah, it's certainly very much.
Sorry. My brain's like, not for you. Yep. Doesn't mind come on either.
This one does.
Last minute decision. I was like, dude, it's my schedule.
Oh, I had to teaching next fall, so.
Oh. Oh, I'm not. That's what teaching myself next spring. I don't know. I think maybe 16 credits.
Sweet. All right, let's roll. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about this idea of culture and the context being related. So there are a couple of concepts that I'd like for you to kind of think about. What's that? Yeah, no, those are my notes. I'll make them bigger for you. So, because I didn't want to just blat them out there. So the two concepts that we'll talk about in terms of cultural competence deals with this idea of a low context culture and a high context culture. So low context culture is a culture where the words are extremely important. The words are precise, right? And typically people perceive themselves as being logical. So if I say, meet me at the circle at 7 o'clock, what do I mean? Meet me at the circle at 7 o'clock. As a matter of fact, you should probably be a little bit early just in case, right? So that's low context. So the everything surrounding the culture is not as important as the goals and objectives of the culture itself. So that's low context culture. But then there is high context cultures where the things surrounding the culture mean everything. And the words are less important. So in this particular context, when I have a high context culture, I will say, meet me at the circle at 7 o'clock. But what do I mean?
Well, meet you around 7 o'clock.
You'll meet me around 7 o'clock. So it could be 7:05, 7:10, 7:30, 6:45, right? And so you'll kind of meet me around 7 o'clock. Do any of you have a friend that you know is going to be late?
Yeah.
Right? You tell them what time, and no matter what time you tell them, and then you start playing that game, right? Well, if I want them there at this time, I better tell them at this time. So, right? So that's the difference between this idea of a low context culture and a high context culture. Low context culture is I mean what I say, and what I say is what I mean. You'll find in low context cultures, you'll find cultures that are very legalistic. Right? So they follow litigious, they follow laws to the nth degree. But then you'll also have high context cultures who a handshake, that is binding. Right? So we have low context culture and high context culture. Yes.
What is that green word underneath high context culture?
Stories.
Stories.
Yes, so it's about stories. So high context culture, stories are important. In the low context culture, this idea of logic is important.
Okay.
All right, so stories. And so in relationship to those low and high context cultures, there are also ways of communicating within those cultures, right? So we have direct communication, direct communication styles, and indirect communication styles. So direct is pretty obvious, right? So direct communication styles is I'm going to talk directly to you. Indirect means I'm going to use some kind of mediator to get my message across to you, right? So we have direct communication and we have indirect communication. We also have this idea of emotional restraint, that I can have a conversation with you, but I'm going to keep my emotions out of it. Has anyone heard someone say that? You know, keep your emotions out of this conversation. You know, your emotion. And what's their fear if emotions get involved? Because they will become illogical, right? My daughter, we were in there's a store called Kirkland's. Has anyone ever been in that store? Right. So we're in Kirkland's and we're, you know, looking at all the stuff. They had a sale, and they had these balloons in the store, and some of the balloons were tied to the thing. And so my daughter is seeing balloons kind of floating around, and she started crying about the balloons, and I was like, "Why are you crying?" She said, "They're stuck. The balloons are stuck." And I was like, "You're right, they are stuck." And now I'm like, I want to cry too. Like, let free those balloons. You know, she was crying. She was like, "They're stuck." And I'm like, that is so empathetic. Like, that is so great that you can, you know. But I said, it's okay. They're supposed to be stuck right now. Like, they're stuck. And I was like, oh. Anyway, so sometimes, and although that was illogical in a sense, that my daughter had put those two things together, but it also demonstrated to me that she is very much a high context kid, right? So the environment really influences her stuff. And so there's this continuum of direct communication versus indirect. And indirect, again, is using some kind of mediator to get your message through. Sometimes we call that gossip, but at any rate, so there's indirect. And then emotional restraint, and then emotional expressiveness, right? Any Italians here? Anybody?
Hey.
Hey! Oh! How do Italians talk? Typically.
Very open and like forward.
Very open and forward, right? Do Italians, do they wait for other people to stop talking so that they can get their point? No. So what's happening with Italians?
You just talk over.
You just talk over. So like while I'm talking, you get your
just like now.
Right.
You just talk louder.
Right. Yeah. So they're emotionally expressive, right? So what we end up with these four quadrants, and we have the direct communication style and the indirect communication style. So when we have emotional restraint and we have direct communication, we have the discussion style. And yes.
What does this diagram represent?
So this is cultural conflict and communication. So cultural conflict and communication. And there are lots of dimensions to this, obviously. So, so there's the discussion style. And so this style says, let's talk about these facts, void of emotions, right? Then there is the engagement style. And the engagement style says, I'm going to talk to you directly about my problem or about my concern, but I'm going to do it with lots of emotion. And when people do that, when people are directing their communication and they're full of emotion, sometimes that gets misconstrued or people get that confused. And what confusion can that cause? What can people say that is when it's not? What might they look like? It might look like someone's angry. It might look like somebody is, upset, that they're agitated, when in fact they could just be expressing themselves, right? I know in my family, people engage in this particular way of communicating, and to people outside, it might seem like they're upset or yelling at each other, when in fact, we're like, no, there's nothing wrong with us. We're just trying to communicate our point, right? That kind of stuff. Then we have this idea of emotional restraint and indirect. And when we talk about this idea of emotional restraint or indirect, we have what we call the accommodation style. Or the face-saving style, right? Now, this notion of face, have you heard this used before? Or do you have an idea what saving face is about?
It's basically, isn't it like when you're trying to say something and like not attack somebody, so you're trying to prove your point or like have a discussion, but at the same time trying to make it look like you're not the bad person, or like you're not having these negative thoughts.
Other folks, yes. Embarrassing. You don't want to embarrass yourself. You don't want to embarrass other people. So you use third-party folks to save face, right? To save face. And then there is the dynamic. And then in the dynamic style, they use some kind of mediator to say, and I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but it would oftentimes happen to me, where people would say to me, Andre, I want you to go and tell them that I said, and it's give me all this stuff to say. And I'm like, why don't you go say it yourself? You know, you're so amped and hyped. But for whatever reason, they don't feel like they can say it themselves. So they use a mediator to kind of get their point across, right? And so the dynamic style is very indirect, but very much engaged. And what can that also look like? What could that be confused with? Passive aggressive. Say what you mean and mean what you say. But with the dynamic group, that's not how they operate, right? What can the discussion style get confused with? Okay, so maybe aggressiveness. What else? Insensitivity. Right? So people will say, well, you don't have a heart. No, I do have a heart, but I want to talk about that without this stuff getting in the way, right? And then the engagement style, people get that confused with being overly emotional or not having a logical argument. And I'll tell you that sometimes when we're in one of these and we're trying to communicate with someone across from that, it really can feel very patronizing when they don't recognize where we are. So I'm not mad, I'm just passionate about my stuff. But if you say, why are you getting mad? Then I'm like, that makes me mad. I wasn't mad before, but yes, that right there. That's the thing. Why don't you understand me? So those are a couple of pieces. Now, this is what I think is really interesting, is that in the United States, this is our style, right? In the Middle East, this is their style. But what's our problem in terms of communication and conflict styles?
They're opposite.
We're total opposites. And what happens when these total opposites try to engage each other? People get offended, they butt heads, particularly if they don't understand that this is what's happening, right? And so here we are, you know, and I'll never forget. And I think I mentioned it before. We thought that going into Iraq and Afghanistan, that was going to be a quick war. We would get in, knock it down. The people will be happy about that. They'll praise us. They'll thank us, and then we'll be out of the country in 8 months. Well, 15 years later, we're still in this thing, right? And mostly because we didn't necessarily understand this. And the funny thing is, if you look at your classroom, you'll have this stuff happening in your classroom, right? You'll have the kids who are really quiet and indirect. They don't show a lot of emotion. They're indirect. And what do we call those kids in our classroom? We call them introverts. We also call them the good kids. And why do we call them good?
Because they aren't causing trouble.
Because what?
They aren't causing trouble.
They aren't causing trouble. Now here's a problem. You have a baby, and your baby is a good baby. They sleep all night long. They don't cry. They don't coo. They don't make any trouble for you. They're just a good baby. And this goes on for 6 months. Baby doesn't cry, doesn't cause problems, isn't irritated, isn't agitated. What would you start saying about your baby after 7 months? There's something wrong. Why?
Good thing you should cry.
They should cry. They should be doing, I mean, there are some developmental things that they should be doing. But when we're teaching, sometimes we get seduced into this accommodating style because they don't make trouble. But guess who, and I'm going to go out on a limb. I would imagine that a number of the school shooters were probably not in a discussion style. I would imagine that the number of the school shooters probably weren't in the engagement style. And I might even go as far as to say that they might not have even been in the dynamic style. Because in the dynamic style, you're at least reaching out to somebody else to do your thing. With this accommodation style, the kids who don't say anything, the kids who are quiet, the kids who are to themselves, I believe oftentimes are the people we need to be most concerned about. Or at least the most, we need to engage them more than we do, because they have talents, they have thoughts, they have dreams, but for whatever reason, they're in a position where they don't necessarily respond to direct communication, and they're not very emotionally expressive. So, you know, what would you do with a kid that was like that in your class?
First, build a relationship with them.
So how would you build a relationship? Okay, so talk with them, being very forward with them. How else would you do it? Yeah.
I think you have to be kind of careful with how you approach it, because coming from a person who I think I was that combination, like safe face, like, oh, we don't want issues, I'll just be fine, like, I'll be quiet in class, like, you don't want to like shove it in their face in
Right.
that manner, so like opening up yourself can really help.
Yeah. How many people found themselves, know you're one of these styles in terms of either this academic experience or previous academic experience?
Mhm.
Yeah. Anybody shift from one to another side? In different situations, okay. Cool. Yeah, no, you definitely don't want to shove it in people's faces. I will say though, that as a teacher, I'm going to keep plowing until we see some fruit, particularly if I know what your goals are, right? So one of my students, and many of you might know him. His radio name is Crisco. Have anybody heard that guy on the radio? Right. So he was one of my high school students, and his real name is Adam. And Adam was just the quirkiest little guy. And when he went so he got his first job, and that's what he wanted to be. He wanted to be a sports announcer. And in high school, he has an interesting voice, right? So he went to be a sports announcer, and we're like, okay, this guy would never stop freaking talking. I'd be like, dude, no, seriously, just stop. Well, Andre, I think that the thing of it, like, Adam, will you just quiet, just chill. And so we got him into some internships, and then he did internships and ended up on the radio. What we helped move him through some of this stuff, because in given certain kinds of situations, he wouldn't talk up when he should, right? So in the face of bullies and stuff like that, he wouldn't stand up for himself. But when he felt comfortable, he would stand up for himself, which concerned us when he went to the radio, because they gave him the name Crisco, and it wasn't flattering. They weren't trying to flatter him, So the teachers, we were writing them like, don't let them call you that, don't, whatever. But I guess, hey, he's grown, he's made the best of it, and now everybody knows him. He's famous, so to speak, for what radio station? Is he KS95 right now? Yeah. He was on KDWB at one point and that kind of stuff. It's not Crisco in the morning yet, is it?
Moon Stacy and Biscuit.
Really? He's billed? I mean, know what I'm saying, you know, Moon says, that's good when you get billing, you know? So one day when he makes it big, I'll be like, you remember your high school teacher? Yes, it was me. Oh, you wouldn't be the man you were today if it wasn't for me. No. But I think it's important to know that you're investing in students because you never know what and who they'll be, right? And so this cultural competence model is important. One last thing I wanted to kind of share with you is this idea of a cultural competency model. In your final, we addressed this idea of cultural competency, and I also put a handout as a hint in your final. So that's there.
Oh, this was the incompetent people.
Yes.
I was like,
We never talked about that. Yeah, I looked at that. I was like, oh, I should have probably told him something about that, huh?
oh, it's not the 15th. Yes.
I'm pretty savvy with all this technology stuff, but why does it always seem to like
Not work when you really
not work when I want to work it?
Hey,
Here we go.
Thanks. Oh, so this is literally like.
So when we talk about this idea of who's had a classroom management class yet? Anyone done classroom management stuff yet?
We've talked about it in classes.
You've talked about it in
There's no
class.
like class specifically.
Okay. You should have a class specifically on classroom
Should.
management. Let me tell you, for real. So my first year of class, so I didn't have any classroom management skills. The only classroom management that I knew was what my teachers did for me, right? That's what I knew about classroom management. So I walk in, so in our classes, the door swung in like this, right? So I had done something and left the classroom and left the kids to their own device. I didn't know any better, right? I didn't know any better. I come in the door, and they had propped the trash can over the door. So when I walked through, the trash fell on me. And I was like, I didn't know what to do. Part of the problem was I didn't have good classroom management skills. So I finally had to sit my principal down and said, you got to help me with these classroom management skills, right? So I need, so she taught me a bunch of stuff. So I said all that stuff to talk just about this idea of classroom management just for a second, because what she taught me helped me a lot, which was, she said, Andre, you have to start off with the rules, and you have to be strict about those rules. You have to be unrelenting about those rules, because once you do that, then you can let up off the rules a little bit, but you can never get tighter with the rules once you've started. So you know, once you have a free flowing class and you know, people can do whatever they want, you can't get control back from the class after you've lost control. Right? So she was suggesting that I keep control. And so what she also suggested is that we move from most restrictive to least restrictive, right? And so when we talk about this idea of cultural competence, we're talking about this idea of most restrictive to least restrictive, particularly in the learning process. And so cultural destructiveness is the most restrictive way that we contribute to evil, right? Cultural destructiveness says that other cultures do not have the right to exist because my culture is the best culture, the one, right? Yes, ma'am.
Exactly attached to the quiz.
This is exactly attached to the quiz. So cultural destructiveness. Then there's cultural incapacity, and that's the lack of systems or in organizations to respond to the needs, interests, preferences of culturally and linguistically diverse groups, right? So again, cultural incapacity means that the organization doesn't know how to respond. And its characteristics include but are not limited to institutional or systemic bias practices that may result in discrimination in hiring, promotion, disappropriate allocation of resources that may benefit one cultural group over another. Subtle messages that some cultural groups are either valued or not welcome, or lower expectations of cultural or ethnic or racial groups. And so this idea that they not only do they not have the capacity, but as a side effect of not having that capacity, they make some assumptions about other groups, right? So I think we saw it in Jeffrey Canada's school, whether you have to bribe somebody or whether you have to, you make it an intrinsic thing, the important thing is to get them to that. And cultural incapacity makes assumptions that people can't do things, so therefore we don't allow them to, right? Cultural blindness is problematic because this is where people say things like, and you may have heard people say this, I don't see color. People are just people. Have you heard people say that? Right? What do they mean by that when they say that? They say, I don't see color. People are just people. What do they mean?
That everybody's the same.
That everybody's the same. Yes.
It's easier just to clump everyone together.
Okay, it's easier to clump everybody together than to talk about their differences. Why is that concept of cultural blindness incomplete and problematic?
There are differences.
Because there are differences. You do see color. You do. If you don't, there's something wrong with you. If you don't see that my skin has a certain kind of hue and pigment, and you don't see that other people have different hair colors, there's something wrong with you if you don't recognize that. Is the recognition the problem? No. What is the concern? What is the problem?
How you act as a result of that recognition.
How you act as a result of that recognition, right? The values that you associate with that recognition. And so when we talk about this idea of cultural blindness, it's an expressed philosophy of viewing and treating all people the same. Characteristics of such systems and organizations may include policies and personnel who encourage assimilation, approaches in delivery of services, and supports that ignore the cultural strengths, institutional attitudes, that blames customers, individuals, or families for their circumstances. So I think it's interesting, this word assimilation. What is that? What is assimilation?
It's when like one person gets rid of like their culture and then takes on another.
Okay, so getting rid of your culture and taking on the dominant culture, which is different than cultural assimilation because, no, I didn't say that right. I was just talking about assimilation.
Yeah.
Assimilation is when the minority group is supposed to take on the majority group's characteristics, right? What is cultural misappropriation or appropriation? Yeah, when a person from the majority culture takes on the attributes of a minority culture, right? So it's kind of so assimilation and appropriation are almost inverted. And so what's the problem with the requirement of assimilation?
It assumes that one is better or more necessary than the other.
Uh-huh. I had to write myself a note, mental note. Yeah, no. So what was Dr. King's? Dr. King said, "I'm very concerned about this idea of assimilation or integration, because he felt as though he was integrating people into a burning house." What did he mean by that? Yes, ma'am.
Was he saying that the majority culture is not like the way that it should be, that it's going to fail, and it's not something he wants to bring people into?
Yeah, like it's got some serious problems, right? Part of it was the Native American problem. Part of it was how we turned on American citizens and put them in internment camps during World War II, right? He saw all those things. He said, you know what, we've got some real problems. And the problem with assimilation is that we are making these expectations that these minority groups will come into be just like the dominant group, but what do we not take into account? What does it take for assimilation to even happen?
Destruction of the person.
So it may be the destruction of the person, but most of us have assimilated. A big part of what I'm trying to do with my daughter is to get her to assimilate to humanity. She took her eggs this morning. She likes eggs. I think she has 2 or 3 eggs, either scrambled, mixed, whatever. And the girl took the eggs and put them on her head. The whole bowl, just. We got to get you to be more human, okay? Right? Will my daughter get it? Yeah, what's it going to take? Time. It's going to take time. And so oftentimes this cultural blindness was like, we're all the same. Let's all do it. We have the same wants and needs. So why can't you get it? And because you can't get it, there's something wrong with you. And then there's this idea of cultural pre-competence, which is where a lot of our schools are and a lot of our workplaces are, because they'll have, let's have a cultural lunch. Everybody bring something from your culture and we'll have a cultural lunch. Or, I had a lady ask me, she said, now, when is Cinco de Mayo?
What?
That's what she asked me. She asked, now when is Cinco de Mayo? Now, I think it's interesting that she knew enough to say the word Cinco de Mayo, but not enough to know that it's the 5th of May, right? pre-competence. It's almost like that football player who almost tried to get it right, right? And he named himself Ocho Cinco. You guys remember that? Yeah. Poor dude. He had no idea what, Ocho Cinco. Yeah. What he meant was 85, but he said Ocho Cinco. How do you say 85 in Spanish? Ochenta y cinco. See, that would have been cooler if he would have said that, but Ocho Cinco. Right, so at any rate. Cultural pre-competence is a level of awareness within a system or organization where there's strengths and areas of growth to respond effectively to culturally and linguistic diverse populations. Characteristics include, but are not limited to, a system of organized, expressed values that deliver high-quality services and supports culturally linguistic diverse populations, committed to human and civil rights, hiring practices that support diverse workforce, the capacity to conduct and assess needs assessments within diverse communities, connected efforts to improve service delivery, usually for specific racial, ethnic, or cultural groups, tendency for token representation or on governing boards, and no clear plan for achieving organized cultural competence, right? So this idea is they're starting to get it. They understand they can't break the law. They understand they have to be in compliance with the law. What does it mean to be a token? What is tokenism? What is tokenism?
The one that represents everything else.
Yeah, the one that represents. I have one black friend. Well, I got lots of black friends. What's a joke? I'm black with black friends. Right. So the token, and I don't think I have. I think I've gotten rid of all my tokens. Did you know I went to Chuck E. Cheese and I asked the lady for some tokens, and she looked at me like I was crazy because we don't use tokens.
What?
Yeah, they don't use tokens. They use the cards.
No.
Yes. I was like, what? I was like, do you still use the little tickets? She was like, yes. I was like, okay. I was like, you're supposed to do customer service. You're supposed to make me feel good about Chuck E. Cheese, right? But at any rate, token representation, just the one of many, right? And so one of the things that we have to be mindful of in the classroom is when we want perspectives on issues, that we don't go to the one student that fits whatever perspective we think we want, right? Because that becomes tokenism, and it's not authentic. And this is another thing I want to tell you, because I was in a classroom and doing some teaching doing some diversity and cultural competence training with some teachers. And I said, if you don't know something about a culture, how do you find out? And guess what the teacher said, which was the wrong answer for the teacher to say, but guess what the teacher said? I'll ask my students, right? Why is that the wrong answer? What's that? No. You said Google?
Like you said, you don't figure it out in the class. You have to know your strategy before you do it.
Yeah. Do your own homework outside of class. That's your homework, right? So, so pre-competence. And so what does cultural competence look like in the classroom? It is this idea that there's a recipe, that the organization, the school, has a diversity goals. It has diversity outcomes, and everybody knows what those are. There's a level of cultural competence that everybody knows. And so create a mission statement for your organization that articulates principles, rationale, and values for cultural and linguistic competence in all aspects of the organization. implement specific policies and procedures that integrate cultural and linguistic competence into each core function of the organization. Identify, use, and adapt evidence-based and promising practices that are culturally and linguistically competent. Develop structures and strategies to ensure consumer and community participation in the planning, delivery, and evaluation of organization's core function. This, I think, is where teaching and learning becomes most impactful, particularly when we talk about this idea of creating equity. As teachers, our job is to be an extension of whom? Parents. We're teaching kids stuff that parents would teach them had they either had the time or the education, and so they're trusting that you will be them in their stead. Most parents, although you may not necessarily see it, but most parents love their children. So when they send them to school, what do they want you to do? They want you to teach them, to love them, to care for them, as if they would if they were there, right? They also want you to give them some skills. So not just love them, but teach them some stuff that the parents couldn't. Parents could or would if they had the time or the resources to do it. Implement policies and procedures to recruit, hire, and maintain a diverse and culturally and linguistically competent workforce. These are the things that cultural competence organizations do. The one I would encourage you to do is, what do we say is an effective way to, so if we had school reform, what would be the one thing that at least I indicated would really transform how schools and education is done in profound ways? Smaller class sizes, right? So how can you decrease your class size without decreasing your class size? Small groups, right? How can you increase the effectiveness of those small groups, being one person? So you can rotate around the small groups. What else? Develop structures and strategies, and invite who to help you implement those? Parents, community, parents, right? So yeah, we have a small group, and I need two parents to sit with the kids as they do their math problems. That's it. Even if the parents don't necessarily know the math problems, the fact that they're sitting there, what does it do for the kids? It focuses the kids more, gives them accountability, lets them know that they're caring adults, gives them some attachment. I mean, it's just amazing what that does. There is, write this down. There is a place called the Search Institute. Has anyone heard of the Search Institute? Okay, I have one person. Okay. Have you heard of the Search Institute? Can you look it up? Search Institute. They have 40 developmental assets that help children grow. So you wrote down Search Institute /Koen Mix dot, write down 40 developmental assets. Look that up. The asset, I mean, and they have them for each age group that you may be working with. So they have they have 0 to K, they have, K to 8, 8 to whatever middle school is. Is middle school 6 to 8?
5, 6.
Yes, yeah, 5, 6, 8. At any rate, they have them broken down by these age ranges. And they really spell out what those, actually, I can pull it up here, what those things are. The other thing is, just talk about cultural competence, provide physical support, dedicate resources for both individual and organizational self-assessment and cultural competence, linguistic competence, develop the capacity to collect and analyze data, and then practice principles of community engagement that result in a reciprocal transfer of knowledge. So we're getting stuff from the parents are getting something from us, so we keep that cycle going, which is important. I'm gonna go to Search Institute real quick and pull up their 40 developmental assets and just show you those, because as a tool for creating equity, I believe if you knock these out, yeah, so these are the assets. Let me see if they put their, yeah. They won't let you print out the PDF. They want you to look at the website. At any rate, so there are the external assets, which are things like family support, positive family communication, other adults in relationship, having a caring neighborhood, having a caring school climate, parental involvement. Again, these are still external assets. This idea of empowerment, community. The community values the youth. They like the youth in their community. There are youth resources. They do service to others and their safety. This is something that, I'm sure in your education, kind of 101 class, you've talked about this idea of boundaries and expectations, that there's this push and pull that kids want limited choices. And that is your job to give them limited choices as opposed to just open choices. And so boundaries and expectations. And it's really funny, if you don't have boundaries and you don't have expectations for kids, they don't respect you, which is weird, because we want to be respected and we want to be engaged. And sometimes you'll hear parents say, well, I don't want them to be mad at me. Well, that might be the best thing for them to do is to be mad at you. There's this idea of the constructive use of time, internal assets, and these are the things that we help build. And I find it interesting that when we look at Richard and Devon, Richard versus Devon, if we can use that as a dichotomy, you can see where this idea of achievement motivation, school engagement, homework bonding with school, reading for pleasure, you can see how that starts to have some positive impact on their intrinsic value and how they see themselves in the world. This idea of these positive values of caring, equity and justice, integrity, honesty, responsibility, and restraint. Particularly when we talk about Devon, who was in the church, do you think they talk about those things in the church? And because his parents are in the church, do you think they talk about these things in their home, right? I'm not sure that Richard's parents, and it's not because they were, because these things are tucked into Devon's religious tradition. I think those things are important. I think Devon being a part of a religious tradition was important, but I'm not saying that you can't have these things if you're not in a religious tradition. So I want to point that out. But I don't think that Richard's mom was in a place to really focus a lot on all of these in a way that she could demonstrate to them in a number of these ways. It's really hard if you're trying to make ends meet to spend a great deal more time doing kind of deeper work or higher expectations. So at any rate, so social competencies, there's positive youth identity, and they have strategies that are age appropriate for all students. So in terms of looking at tools, so we presented you with the 40 developmental assets. We've talked about this idea of the cultural competence continuum. We've kind of laid out this fabric of oppression that helps us to look at that stuff. We've talked about conflict and communication styles as tools. What are some other tools that you can walk away with and say, you know what, Andre did introduce us to this concept or this tool that we can use in our classroom? What was another one? Understanding people's goals, right? And which are safety, significance, and belonging. You just leave it alone. Right? Understanding people's goals. What else?
Understanding that what you put in the cup is what comes out.
Understanding that what you put in the cup is what comes out. And the cup can be you. The cup can also be your students, right? Interestingly enough, I remember hearing my students saying things that I said to them outside of me, right? So I overheard something. Oh. What else? All right. Being overly talkative was not one of those things, and I accept you just as you are. So, yes, ma'am.
The breakdown of difficult conversations and why they happen. What emotion.
Yeah. No, when Jason did that, I was like, oh, that's awesome, because that is true. A lot of times we're talking about the what, but we're not talking about the what, and we're talking about more. Right. So yeah. So that's important. Yeah. Cool. All right. Touch your neighbor and say, no, I'm just teasing. She got excited. She was like, oh, I get to touch my neighbor and say something. No, I just want to say thank you so much for class. And if there are no other questions, comments, or observations, we are done. I will finish all grading stuff by Monday, so if you have anything left to get in, please do. I think I've covered everything in the final. There are some names that pop up, and they come from the videos that we watched, or the Race to Power Evolution. So, what's that?
I thought you were talking about our names for a second.
Oh yeah, no. There are names in the final. But they're addressing people who were.
Place for us to upload a picture from the science museum, and you just want to take that.
Okay. So, yeah. If you need to email me, that's fine. But
I will. Thank you.
I mean, I do have
Yes,
proof.
sir.
I can let you see it
Thank
now.
you.
Go with my sisters. Oh my gosh, I actually do want to show you.
that is funny.
I have two young sisters. I have a 7-year-old sister and a 4-year-old sister.
That is funny.
So we took them, or I